Good evening, everybody. My name is Andy Elders. I'm with Justice Forward Virginia.
And I'm Ashley Shapiro, also with Justice Forward Virginia.
And we're here to talk a little bit about pretext stops, racial profiling, and what's next in the fight for racial justice and better drug policy while we're at it. So we want to start with a quick discussion of what pretext stops are. We don't want to assume that anybody is already too deep into the world we live in. So a pretext stop, to put it really simply, is when a police officer stops you because they have some other reason that they want to search your car, your person, or ask you some questions. Usually, in the vast majority of cases, they're stopping you because they think that you or someone in your car has drugs, and they want to ask you about it so that they can arrest you, and then probably so that they can try to find the person who sold the drugs to you, and so they can try to move up the chain. So that's what a pretext stop is. But they can't just pull a car over because they think someone might have drugs. They're required to have either reasonable articulable suspicion that you have drugs in the car, and in these cases, they don't have it. So instead, they're using a pretext stop. A pretext stop means that they are using some other reason to stop your car as an excuse to take the next step and then start investigating some other crime that they didn't have cause for otherwise. So Ashley, tell us a little bit about the kinds of things that people pull someone over for in a pretext situation that you see in your cases.
So as Andy said, they have to have at least some sort of a legal justification for pulling someone over. What we saw most often is very minor parts of the car that they can target that have absolutely nothing to do with safety. So this would be broken taillight, or even the third brake light, which most people don't even know exists, or the light that illuminates the license plate, or dangling object. So many people have, for example, air fresheners, which is something that you can buy at any store and you can hang from your rearview mirror, but police are allowed to use that, or were allowed to use that as an excuse to pull someone over. Now, obviously, there's no safety concern. They're using it as an excuse so that they can get to the person, get to the car, and eventually do that search. The studies have shown, and all the stops have shown, that the use of these pretext stops are racially biased, incredibly racially biased. When you look at the statistics versus the population, these excuses to pull people over are largely used against people of color in order to initiate an initial police contact. And then from there, more people of color are pulled over, and then it spirals out from there. More people are searched, more people are arrested, and then can go enter into the criminal system from there.
And to give a little context for how this is all justified, you always hear the same things from proponents of pretext searches anytime that these things happen. They say, look, we're just doing normal traffic enforcement. And that's what they always call it, traffic enforcement. And they call it traffic enforcement because there are literally hundreds of laws that govern the way that you can drive your car, and this, the equipment.
And the way your car should even look.
Right.
Not even driving.
Looks, the way it sounds, the way it smells. And so there's so many excuses that a trained officer can pull pretty much anyone they want to over. I remember years ago reading No Equal Justice, and Professor Cole talking about they pull cars over because they're going too fast. They pull them over because they're going too slow. They pull them over because they're going exactly the speed limit. They pull them over because it's late at night. They pull them over because it's early in the morning. And you go through the list of the justifications for racial profile. But the people who support these things are going to say the same things. Look, there have been cases where extremely serious crimes were solved because we pulled a car over. There have been cases where potentially dangerous situations were averted because we pulled cars over. And that's part of the justification that is given for why these things are important, why they're necessary. Needless to say, the same justification can be used for any invasion of privacy and any denial of a constitutional right. The most severe version of that is, look, we could lock up everybody in America and nobody would sell drugs on the street because there would be no one on the street, right? And you can start to tick back from there as you go. We could pull over every car we see. We could have checkpoints at every curb where every time you stop your car, the police can come over and search your car. And I'm sure we would find lots of contraband for a while because that's what happens if you turn from a privacy-based state where people are free to a state that is entirely run and controlled by the police. We've chosen not to do that as a country and as a group of people. And so the idea here is that the justification that pulling a bunch of people over and searching them and making up stories about why you're searching them or why you're pulling over their cars, it would solve more crimes probably. But think of all the things we lose in the meanwhile, and now you have the sort of ideological debate that leads to the kinds of laws that we've started to pass here in Virginia.
We also have to look at the fact that when they're using this to justify, they say, well, look at these guns and drugs that we found. And when, for example, Andy and I see these cases, it's because they are in the criminal system. They've been charged with something. The police have charged them with either guns or drugs or whatever the case may be. So we see what the police would say is a positive result of this. Well, look, we found something illegal. But what we don't see is the hundreds and thousands of people where they found nothing, where their privacy rights were violated for absolutely no reason, where I've had a grandfather literally be stripped in the freezing cold while his grandson had to watch them for 20 minutes search his car to find absolutely nothing except an old open beer can. Those are the stories that we're concerned about. So while the police want to say, well, some of these result in charges, sure, some of them do, but a whole lot more just are an invasion of privacy that are usually based on race-based reasons and then don't result in anything that would make us any safer.
And because we see cases where people get pulled over, we see cases where evidence was found as a result of these searches. And if the search was illegal, in our cases, the evidence gets kept out. That's the exclusionary rule, that if a search was conducted or a stop was illegal, if there was an illegal search, illegal stop, those things, any evidence that results from it is inadmissible at trial. And that's why you hear people say, my case got thrown out because the search was illegal. The remedy for people whose cars are pulled over, or who are pulled out of the car and sat on the curb for hours at a time while they search their car and don't find anything, is nothing. And that's partially because of qualified immunity. That's partially just because there is no mechanism for a search that turns out to be fruitless, and because we rely on the exclusionary rule in the criminal system. So what that means is all of the people who get pulled over and all the people whose lives are disrupted, who are put through this process that is certainly stigmatizing, to be sat on a curb or to have your car pulled over to the side of the road while the police sit in their car and the red lights flash and everybody in the neighborhood sees what's going on, and somebody tells your cousin or tells your parents, and those things reverberate through a community. The feeling of the police constantly being on your doorstep or in your car or in your property, it means something. And it means something to a community. And you see, when you talk to people who live in high policed communities, the impact that those things have on them. Absolutely. I think there's also an aspect of this that it's just not what the Constitution envisioned. The Fourth Amendment has been whittled down so many times over such a period of time that it no longer resembles anything like what was expected when the Fourth Amendment was crafted. The idea was that we were supposed to be secure in our persons, our belongings. There weren't really vehicles at the time, but there were, I guess the analogies to cars at the time would have been anytime you're traveling, I'm not trying to get into horses versus cars, but, those things were important. And those things are enshrined in our Constitution for a reason, is because people were outraged at the way that the government interacted with people on an everyday basis. And the idea that you would have hundreds of thousands of warrantless searches at a time, in a jurisdiction would have been really outrageous to the people who wrote the Constitution. And we've gotten so far afield of what it means to be personally free with regard to your stuff, your car, your house, and your pockets, that it's meaningful. It's meaningful because we're constantly eroding what the government can do to you in the name of public safety and in the names of trying to fight the war on drugs. I want to talk a little bit about the racial disparity piece. Ashley, you spoke about it a little bit. There's a lot of different pieces of it from my perspective, all of which result in the same thing, which is people like me very rarely get pulled over and have their cars searched. I've been pulled over for lots of speeding tickets, but nobody ever asked me if I had any drugs in the car. Nobody ever asked me to get out of my car so they could write me a ticket, because that's not my experience, and it's not the experience of people like me. A lot of times the criminal system and our legislative system ignores that. And it happens in a lot of different ways. One of them is, what we think of as structural racism. And that's racism that is not necessarily about the race of the person being pulled over, but other signifiers where the system's been built around those signifiers. And the result is that Black people get harassed by the police, get pulled over by the police. Sometimes that has to do with geography. Sometimes it has to do with poverty. But the reality of what America has been for the last 250, 300 years is that the people who get pulled over just by routine applications of the criminal system are people of color, Black people, Latinos, and people who are more likely to live in overserved communities with respect to the police. But some of it's about what we've chosen to make illegal too.
Yeah, when you look at how the legislature has gone through and you look at how each of these pretexts even came to be, you look at things like mufflers, and that's something that the legislature had previously made a very subjective determination of what was going to be normal, what was going to be okay, and then they would use those standards that are completely subjective, have nothing to do with the safety of the car, have nothing to do with the community even, and then they use those things such as just the sound a car makes, and they use it in certain areas where that type of car is going to be more common, where you have a car that might have aftermarket modification to make it louder or to change the sound of the car, and they make those types of things illegal. They make placards that come, on the rearview mirror. That's something that when you look at college kids that have their tassels hanging from their mirrors, that's not something that they ever get stopped for. But when you look at people who have air fresheners, or I've even had a handicap placard that was government issued, that was still technically a legal stop at the time, and how those particular what they choose to target and how they choose to target it is, even whether it's intentional or unintentional, certainly the way that it's used, the studies show it's completely racially biased in how it's actually borne out.
On people who park on the street as opposed to people who
Sure.
park in their own garages, right? Or people who park in public spaces because they don't have as much money and they don't have a garage, or maybe they live in an apartment building that doesn't provide parking. But it's not just that; it's also the drugs and alcohol that we choose to make legal versus illegal. If they're searching a car because historically someone at some point decided that cocaine was something that needed to be made illegal, or something, or the next step over is that marijuana needed to be made illegal. And very much at the time that those drugs were made illegal and that the prohibition came out, it was because use of those drugs was associated with people of color, where alcohol, which we made illegal for a second, but then a whole bunch of white people got mad and then we unmade it illegal. You see that over the years, alcohol, which has many more destructive tendencies than marijuana, certainly, was kept legal. And the police go to neighborhoods where they say, hey, lots of people smoke weed in this neighborhood, we're going to pull cars over. We need to enforce the law. But neighborhoods where lots of people drink alcohol, like, you see a block party in a nice white neighborhood and everybody's standing around with a beer in their hand or a glass of wine and nobody cares. But if the same thing was happening in another neighborhood where the people looked a little different, suddenly there'd be enforcement decisions that would change. And that brings me to that kind of the next point, which is part of the reason that these cars get pulled over is because they've been selected. The neighborhoods that the people live in have been selected for added police enforcement. And sometimes that's because they're dubbed high crime areas. And other times it's because the police have decided that those are areas that require additional enforcement. And, study after study shows that it's not that Black people or people in Black neighborhoods use drugs more, that people use drugs equally in all different walks of life. They might be different drugs, but even talking about illegal use, there's no studies that suggest that Black people or Latino communities use drugs more or abuse drugs more than white people. It's just the level of enforcement that is dedicated in those communities and the number of cars that get pulled over, and then the drugs are found, and then law enforcement gets involved, and then that gets reported. And so the crime numbers in that area go up. And now it's a high crime area because of all the police that were there pulling cars over and finding the crimes that were occurring. And so it's the selective enforcement and the police decisions about which neighborhoods they're going to patrol and who's going to get their attention that tend to drive these decisions. And suddenly you have the police creating areas where people have lower privacy expectations and more cars are getting pulled over. And then it just comes down to simple racism. Ashley Ashley works in Richmond, and I'm sure she's seen one or two cases like these. I remember a couple cases in Fairfax where people report suspicious vehicles in the area, and the suspicious vehicles are vehicles with Black people in them. Or we had one case where someone called the police, and the police showed up because there were two Black men in a car outside with a gun. Well, being Black in a car is not illegal, and in Virginia, having a gun out in public is not illegal. There was nothing illegal about that call, but the police showed up. They searched that car. They arrested someone and took them. The case went to circuit court before it got thrown out. And someone said, "Hey, there's nothing illegal about this call." And I can imagine that these things are at least as bad, if not worse, depending on which neighborhood you're in your jurisdiction as well, Ashley.
Well, we had the Richmond Transparency and Accountability Project fought for years to get the police to actually release this data. And not shockingly, the police did not want to release it and fought tooth and nail against it. And when they did finally release it, it was exactly what we all expected, which was that when you talk about suspicious vehicles, 71% of suspicious vehicles in Richmond were people that were Black people in this city, which is 2.5 times higher than white people being stopped. And why is that?
Something suspicious about cars with Black people in them in Richmond.
Right. And it's just like you said, where are they going? They're not going in the predominantly white neighborhoods. They're not looking at the block parties over there. They're going into the neighborhoods in this city that are predominantly Black, predominantly people of color. And they're arresting people. They're stopping people. Even just looking at pedestrian encounters, it was well above. It was over 70% of those encounters. Why? Because of where they're choosing to police. And then they choose to police, and it spirals into, well, now that we're here, we've found crime. And then it turns into a high crime neighborhood only because it's actively being policed. There would be just as much crime if they went a few miles west, but they just don't. That's where all of our police are. If you just drive around the city, you'll see 15 police cars in one neighborhood and none elsewhere. And that is solely because of the policy decisions that have been made to over police and over legislate Black people in this city. And I say Black people in this city because it's a majority Black city. And that's the people that they're choosing to enforce it against. And they're going to specific neighborhoods. You look at even curfew violations. So they're just looking at kids on the street for underage kids. 98% were Black children. And that's who our police are stopping. It has nothing to do with their criminality. These are just kids playing just like other kids do, except if you are in the city and you are a person of color, you're a target. And that's something that technically is legal, because if they can find an excuse, then they're allowed to do it. And that's why we sought to limit the number of excuses that they could use to even stop that interaction before it starts.
And needless to say, these issues are not limited to Fairfax or Richmond, but it's a problem throughout the Commonwealth. And so we at Justice Forward, with a lot of our allies, sought over the last few years to try to address these things on a Commonwealth-wide basis by trying to change some of these laws. So Ashley, do you want to take a second to kind of go through what happened in 2020 and 2021 in terms of pretext reform and trying to preserve people's privacy?
Absolutely. So this is, I think, for us, probably at least my most proud piece of legislation that we were able to get passed, because I think that stopping people from even getting into the criminal system is the best thing that we can possibly do to limit the police interactions, so you don't have people dying in police stops, just a traffic stop that goes wrong, which we've seen happen across this nation. So we looked at, we're a bunch of public defenders, so we all kind of got together and looked at what we saw as the most egregious abuses, the excuses that the police were using at the highest rate and that were the most ridiculous, and again had nothing to do with the safety of the car. And we got together a list of about 10 to 12 of the most frequently used, and convinced people that these specific stops were being used solely for pretext reasons. They were not being used for traffic moderation. They were being used as a pretext to stop people and then to arrest people. So we went through, as I mentioned earlier, broken taillight, one broken headlight. Also, as Andy said, registration, particularly in times of COVID. If your car is parked outside, the police can see that. Whereas if your car is parked safely in a garage, they're not going to be able to see it. So when you look at registration and inspection, there's also a monetary aspect to that. You have to pay to do both of those things. So we looked at the fact that who's being pulled over for that. And that's, again, had racially disparate outcomes. We looked at dangling object. That was a huge one that we see. As I said, they're not using it on college campuses. They're going into neighborhoods for things that are perfectly legal to have there. You have an air freshener. It is designed to go there, and yet these are excuses being used to pull people over. And we really targeted those. As Andy said, there's literally thousands of violations that go into when you get your car inspected that they can look at. We tried to get rid of that entire code section. That was not well received. There are a few things in there that I suppose we should have, but we were able to really tackle the most egregious violators. And I've already heard police complain about this all the time. They get so mad, and it just makes my heart happy that they can no longer use these excuses. And because they weren't using it for any other reason, they were using it to look for guns and drugs. Whether your tail light is out has absolutely nothing to do with what's inside your car. And they were just using it as an excuse. And then we also included in that a remedy for court. Again, it only helps you if you've already been thrown into the criminal system. But we made it so that in the code section, if a police officer violates this law and searches your car and finds something, they cannot use that evidence against you.
And just to be clear what the effect of the law is, there are certain offenses that are called primary offenses in Virginia. That means if a police officer believes you're violating that law, they can pull you over for that reason to investigate it. But there's a class of offenses that are called secondary offenses, meaning if the police have already pulled you over, if they encounter your vehicle and it's already stopped, they can write you a ticket for those offenses, but they're not serious enough to pull you over for those offenses. And what the legislation actually did over in 2020 was make it so that if you violated certain laws, they were no longer primary offenses, meaning the police couldn't use them as an excuse to pull you over, which undercuts the pretextual effect of stops for those kinds of offenses.
And a primary offense would be something like speeding, right? That's something that's actually a danger. That's something that the police, I think most of us could agree, have the right to pull someone over for the safety of the community. The rest of these don't have anything to do with that. So by making them secondary, the police can no longer use it as the excuse. And if they do, then they're not allowed to use that evidence anyway. So it's a good deterrent effect in the law.
And part and parcel of that legislation, which was, I guess, in a sense, was changed even further by the fact that marijuana, simple possession, is no longer a crime. At the time, is that saying an odor of marijuana was not a basis for stopping or searching a vehicle. And the latter, the search of a vehicle based on the odor of marijuana, was particularly important because I can't even tell you what percentage of car vehicle searches were in my practice, and I'm guessing it's very much the same in Richmond, were the result of an officer pulling over a car and then saying, okay, I smell marijuana, get out of the car, I'm going to search it.
And in how many of those searches did they find marijuana?
Not as many as you would think if you weren't already in the game. I think that, it used to be that just the odor of marijuana was a justification for a search, that you didn't need any further cause. If you smelled weed in the car, or you said you smelled weed in the car.
Or you smelled it as the car was driving by at 20 miles an hour.
Right. Now that's changed a little further because now the odor of marijuana isn't an indication of a crime at all, because possession of marijuana or smoking marijuana is not a crime, depending on where you smoked it and when. And that's a complicated story that I'm guessing will be covered in other sessions as well. But that's what's happened in the past. So I think our next area that we're going to talk about is what can we do going forward to build on the success of pretext legislation and try to further protect the privacy of people who are out there. And the easiest answer is, look, I think the legislation that we passed in 2020 was 7, 8, 9 offenses and taking them out of primary offense status and moving them to secondary offense. And one answer, needless to say, would be go back through the code and pull out another 10 and try to keep chipping away at the kinds of power that the police have to pull cars over. Inevitably, they're going to find new ones and they're going to pull cars over for new reasons. I had a stop in a case that I had video on that was incredibly pretextual. They held the guy there on the side of the road for 45 minutes while they brought a drug dog. The drug dog didn't hit, but then they looked inside the car and in a visual search found something else that was there. And so there were all these issues and it was a terrible stop. But that case came out of somebody trying to go through a go through a strip mall to avoid a stoplight, which is the kind of thing that, if it's safe, probably isn't the kind of thing that really justifies stopping a vehicle. It might make you mad as a driver who waited in line, and you might not like it. But those are the kinds of decisions that we're making, is this sort of balancing test. So I'm sure we could go through and find another 10. But I think we're hoping in the future to think about things on a bigger level, because otherwise we're just entrusting the police not to just find some new reason to pull people over, because, as we said, there are hundreds, and trying to go through and get them all is very hard.
And we've already seen that they've done that. Now that they can't do these 10, they're trying to find more excuses. And that's the nature of the game. I mean, that's what they want to do until we actually get at the crux of the problem, which partly the odor of marijuana has significantly decreased the amount of searches. So that was a huge stop. But then even looking forward to consent searches, and something that most people think is fairly normal. If you have an interaction with the police and they ask you nicely if they can search you and search your car, why shouldn't that be allowed? Why shouldn't the police just be able to get your consent once they've lawfully pulled you over to search your car? As Andy said, I've never been asked to have my car searched, and I have a somewhat storied driving history. I have a few tickets in my background. And I've never had my car searched. I've never even been asked. I get my ticket and I go along my way, and neither has Andy. And that's a consent search. And that's where our focus is going next. Right, Andy?
Yeah. So the thing about consent searches is, if an officer is asking for your permission to search the car, it means he already has decided he doesn't have probable cause, and he doesn't have a warrant for sure.
Meaning he doesn't have a legal basis to do so.
Correct. Right. And the Constitution lays out the circumstances under which you can search a vehicle, and then case law afterwards expanded it to say, well, there are certain circumstances where you can conduct a search. But if you give the police permission to search your car, the courts are going to call that a voluntary interaction, and then the police don't need any justification whatsoever. But here's what happens. Your car gets pulled over. There's a police officer. He's got a gun on his hip. He's shining a flashlight into your eyes, maybe. He's asking you a bunch of questions, and he's on the side of the road, and you feel like you're at his mercy. Are you going to get arrested? Are you going to get a ticket? What happens if you say no to someone in that situation? If the police officer says, hey, can I see your license and registration? And you say no. Or if the police officer says, what are you doing here? And you say, I don't want to answer any questions. Those are all things where a layperson has no idea what they're allowed to say no to. And it's tricky, because under the law, you're allowed to say no to some things. You're not allowed to say no to others. And no one is required to give you, the driver of the vehicle, an honest list or any honest legal advice about what your rights are in that moment. Meaning that people are regularly asked to waive Fourth Amendment rights. Their right not to be searched, their right not to be pulled out of their car, their right to be searched in their person or their vehicle. No one tells them what their rights are in that moment. They just say, you mind if I look around your car? And they're leaning in, and they've got a big hat on, maybe if they're a trooper, and they've got a gun, and then maybe they've got a camera on you. Maybe they're shouting at you. Maybe their partner is on the other side of your vehicle. It's a very intimidating situation for me. A white guy who does not have a history of my family or my friends or my community being harassed and threatened, and in many cases, physically intimidated by the police. So you take someone who is not a lawyer, who is in their 20s or younger, who has a history of seeing people get thrown in jail and sit in jail for days at a time before they can get bond, or seeing someone get arrested and dragged out of their car and handcuffed and put face down on the street while people stare at them. And suddenly they start to think, what do I need to do to avoid the worst case scenarios here? What do I need to do to avoid becoming the next story that people are marching in the streets about? And
I think that's an important point, is that we're not just talking about maybe getting pulled out of your car. Right. We're talking about dying. That's right. People are rightfully concerned, if you do not comply with everything the police demand of you, that you could wind up dead easily. You look at Philando Castile, you look at these stories where the person did nothing wrong except maybe didn't immediately cede to the police authority, and they're killed. They're murdered by the police. And then the police usually don't have there's no consequence for them. And so when you look at a consent search and that's what seemingly simple request, it's not. The power dynamic there is all of the power is entirely with the police. The authority there, the coercion that goes into the simple question of, can I search your car? It's not consensual. I would go so far to argue that it's impossible to have a consent search, a voluntary search under those circumstances, because no person reasonably thinks they can say no.
Well, and just stop and think about it. Like, a consent search means that you, like, if you thought about it in the context of sex, if you said someone was consenting because they were afraid that something bad was going to happen to them if they didn't, no one in their right mind would say that that was consent, right? But when we talk about the police on the side of the road and they say, look, either you can consent to me searching your car or I can bring the dogs out, that's not consent, that's a threat. Or if it's an implicit threat because the officer has a gun in his hip, those are the kinds of things where, why would anyone consent to have their car searched? Why would anyone say, you know what I'd really like? I'd like to sit over here on this curb while you go through all my stuff and throw it all around and trash my car and open my trunk and look inside my glove box and look inside the center console and see what you might find. Why would anyone consent to that? And no, the reality is, like you said, no one does. No one wants those things to happen to them. They're just going through a complicated and usually completely uninformed analysis of what happens if I say no to this person in a position of power. What if I assert my rights? Am I going to end up on the news? Am I going to end up in a jail cell? Am I going to end up with things going worse for me? I don't know the answer to that question. And so I'm going to say, yeah, I guess. And that is deemed in a court consent. But the reality, like you said, is there's no such thing as a consent search. No one wants those things to happen to them. They're just agreeing to do it because they're afraid something worse is going to happen, or because they don't know their rights, or both. So one of the steps that we're hoping to push in this session is a complete ban on consent searches. If the police have a warrant, if they have probable cause, they can proceed with the search. And if they don't, they can't, and they can't ask. So that's, to me, the simplest solution to all this. And if you say, hey, Andy, that doesn't actually relate directly to pretext stops, I would argue that it does. Because if the police have probable cause, they don't need to do pretext anymore, right? And if they know that they can't just pull a car over and, intimidate and or trick someone into letting them search their car, if they don't think they can search the car, they're not going to bother. It's not going to be worth their time. And so you go to the root cause of why the police are pulling these cars over rather than merely the mechanism. I think there's one other thing that we haven't talked too much about, but it's probably worth mentioning because it's starting to gain some steam in other places, which is just getting the police out of traffic enforcement altogether. And we're used to just accepting that the police are the ones who pull your car over, that the same people who have guns and are looking for drugs are the same people that decide whether or not you get a speeding ticket or whether or not you violated traffic laws. And in many places they're starting to say, hey, we don't need to do that. We can turn down the heat on some of these traffic stops and separate out traffic enforcement from attempts to, enforce misguided drug laws or other criminal offenses. We can separate those things out, let the police investigate crimes, and let other people who maybe aren't armed or who maybe don't have incentives to try to investigate further, let them enforce traffic laws. I think that's the kind of thing that's not going to happen in a year in Virginia, but over the course of time, it may be that's a better solution too.
Absolutely.
Ashley, any more thoughts about what pretext reform means on a broader scale in Virginia, or what it means for communities where the police are more likely to invade people's privacy?
And a broader goal is just to keep police out of people's lives where they're not needed. But when we think of sort of a civil society, I wouldn't go so far as to say we don't need the police, although it's certainly arguable. But what they should be focusing on is keeping us safe. And accosting people and creating crime is not keeping us safer. In fact, it's making us more unsafe. It is dismantling communities. It is invading people's privacy, and it's violating people's rights. And by limiting the power of the police, because let's be honest, there's not really any consequence when they do violate their roles, and their roles are so broad, it's hard for them to even go past it because they have almost infinite power. So the only way, at least with our current structure, to really make a change is to limit what they can do from the start, to limit what they're even allowed to enforce, what they're allowed to investigate, and what they're allowed to police. And only in doing that can we fundamentally lessen and drastically lessen civilian interaction with the police. And once that happens, you'll see arrests go down, you'll see police violence go down because they're not having interaction with people, so there can't be violence. And you'll see communities, I think, become safer because they're not being so overly policed. And there's going to, which would increase the trust of the police when they're actually doing their jobs, rather than going to certain communities, over policing them, and using racially biased reasons to interact with the community.
Yeah, on some level, I agree with everything you're saying, of course, about the effectiveness of these interventions and them putting more people into the system and making communities less safe. There's also a piece of it that always strikes me on a fundamental level, is that it's a matter of dignity and respect for people who live in communities that are over-policed and where the police feel like it's their job to insert themselves into the everyday lives of people, people who are just minding their own business, people who are people who are successful and are pulled over by the police because they think that what they're doing is suspicious because they look out of place in their communities. People whose kids are making mistakes just like our kids make mistakes. And by our kids, I mean white kids. People whose kids are just out there making mistakes and being kids and are being treated like criminals who are dangerous to society, as opposed to just kids who are out there having a good time. And, every now and then maybe they need to be pulled back a little bit. But the difference in the way that Black young people and Black children are treated as opposed to white young people and white children, it's an affront not only to their lives, but also to the respect that is due to a community to allow kids to play in the street, like you said, talking about Richmond curfews, or to drive your car at night with 3 other kids in the car, maybe like a bunch of 19-year-olds, and in neighborhoods that I know of, that is a lock that they're going to get pulled over and harassed by the police. And you can imagine the sort of anger that engenders within a community to know that their children and their brothers and sisters and their parents are being treated that way. It's really corrosive. And it's time for us to look at those communities and say that those communities deserve the same respect and the same dignity that our communities get. And to me, that's a really fundamental level of equality that I don't think we've ever had in this country, and that I hope Virginia will continue to push for in years to come. So thank you for the time. And obviously it wasn't just Justice Forward who's been part of this fight. There have been lots of other organizations pushing alongside of us, and a lot of legislators and a lot of other activists who have been really deep into these reforms. We hope that in the years to come, we'll continue to see progress on some of these issues, because it's about dignity, it's about justice, and it's about equality. And there's still a lot of work to do. Thank you.
All right, thank you.